we talk about the incident in 9/11, it's better we talk about the story of things like Al Qaeda and the reason for them existing in the first place. Afghanistan was once a territory owned by Britain with no advantages to the region, only being a blockade from Russia, really with only rural areas for mainly an agricultural society. Some guy named Zahir Shah decided he wanted to modernize his country, but claimed zero taxes due to only having two cities technically under his control. Only having tribes in places of Afghanistan, which didn't really care too much about the whole modernization thing. The only thing they cared about was agricultural and things they've been doing for hundreds of years, which is farming, and that's it. That's basically it. Just farming. That's it. No modernization here. Zero taxes. We like this. Due to the lack of political reform, he was overthrown by Dodd Khan. After this, Dodd Khan would rule with a communist economic and government system, due to the funding of Afghanistan's national bank mainly being the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union took over after another coup only 5 years after Dodd's coup, with the Soviet made a new Afghan republic under Soviet rule, making the country a full Soviet puppet state. The government would start trying to split these rural areas equally. The only problem with that is that nobody knew who actually owned these areas. This would be the spark in which several militia groups would be formed, like Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Soviets, seeing the rebellion, would now try to invade Afghanistan to put down these rebellions, but eventually they would fail, and Soviets would start fleeing from Afghanistan. With this, the Taliban would take over. This would also be the time where Al Qaeda and other militias would not like US involvement in the Middle East. So this would spark Middle Eastern hate towards the US, and US hate towards the Middle East. In the end, both sides bombing several of their businesses and embassies, mainly the US embassies and Afghanistan businesses, owned by the Taliban. In the end, this would all lead to the bombing of the World Trade Center and the planned bombing on the Pentagon.
To make those rainbows in my mind when I think of you sometime, and I want to spend some time with you, just the two of us. We can make it if we try.
Before the attack, it's important to know that Osama has expressed hate towards the US publicly before this attack. 4 planes would be planned to be hijacked with 19 men aboard each plane on the morning of September 11, 2001. 2 Boeing 757s and 2 Boeing 767s. Both were headed to California, taking off from Logan International Airport in Boston, Newark Liberty International Airport in Newark, New Jersey, and Washington Dulles International Airport in Virginia. America Flight 11 had the pilot Mohammed Atta hitting between 93rd and 99th floor of the North Tower. United Flight 175 had Marwan al-Shehi took over flying this plane and hit the South Tower, hitting between floors 85 and 77. The next plane, America Flight 77, would be flown by Hani Hanjour, aiming and hitting the west side of the Pentagon. The final flight was United Flight 93, but after being hijacked later then, the other flights, this one was retaken due to more passengers on board, and having the passengers on board learning of what happened to the World Trade Center and Pentagon, being able to coordinate with 911 operators, although not hitting their potential targets, it still would crash in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. As well, the President, H.W. Bush, gave his first speech since the 2 planes had crashed.
Thank the folks here at the Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
At 9:59, the South Tower would begin to collapse only 56 minutes after the plane struck it. Several people below breathed in harsh materials into their lungs, killing and causing permanent lung damage to those who couldn't find shelter. At 10:28, the North Tower began to collapse an hour and 42 minutes after the impact. Planned by Osama after several U.S. bombing campaigns It saw one of the worst attacks on the U.S. since Pearl Harbor. At 8:30 p.m., President Bush gave an address to the American people.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. Bin Laden calls this fight the Third World War, and he says that victory for the terrorists in Iraq will mean America's defeat and disgrace forever. If we yield Iraq to men like Bin Laden, our enemies will be emboldened. They will gain a new safe haven. They will use Iraq's resources to fuel their extremist movement. We will not allow this to happen. America will stay in the fight. Iraq will be a free nation and a strong ally in the war on terror.
Osama bin Laden, before the U.S. presidential election, released a video saying that he was responsible and gave why he had done so because of the American support of attacking Muslims around the world and the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. Also, sanctions against Iraq and American support for Israel. So the U.S. went on a manhunt through Afghanistan and Pakistan, soon finding bin Laden in his compound on May 1st, 2011 in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would be held in Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba ever since 2003, when he was captured and tortured into giving a confession on the 9/11 attack and his role in it. Ever since then, he is now waiting trial, with the Biden administration weighing a plea deal that would take the death penalty off the table. After this, the war on terror was basically the bombing and war on militia groups or criminal gangs in the Middle East, primarily in Afghanistan and Pakistan, mainly the Taliban. Then something happened in 2011. Osama would be captured, which was good for the US and bad for the rest of Afghanistan, because this meant NATO involvement became US involvement, so eventually NATO and the US would pull out. This would also be the start to the end of this video because it's getting way too long. Of course, as predicted, the Taliban would take over after 20 years of US involvement in Afghanistan. With this, the president would also be given the most power it has ever gotten with the Authorization for Use of Military Force Act of 2001. In the end, it's important to understand that things that the Taliban do does not reflect on Afghan or Muslim culture, having the people be very diverse and very religious. Without personal experiences, I must say, like everything, that it's all shades of gray and it's never labeled as all black and white.
212. How do him hold heat and preach non-violence? He about to start the speech, come on, silence. On one starry night, I saw the light. Heard a voice that sounded like Barry White. Said, sure, you're right. Don't let me find out who tried to bite. They better off going to fly a kite in a firefight during tornado time with no coat, then I caught ya. Wrote the book on rhymes, a note from the author with no headshot. He said it's been a while, got a breadwinner style to get an inner child to finna smile.